the empire that seemed eternal. The day Rome fell, the world changed forever. But it was not a sudden fall, it was not a single blow. It was not a single battle. It was an inevitable, silent, slow erosion. For centuries, Rome was more than a city. It was a concept, an idea, a promise of order in the face of chaos. From the walls of the Rhine to the sands of North Africa. From Britannia to Mesopotamia, the Roman Empire dominated territories than any other power. Had previously controlled, his legions marched with mathematical precision. Their heroes built roads that even today survive. Its laws shaped Western civilization. But even the most powerful empire can die. And Roma began to die when he stopped fearing his enemies and began to fear herself. Rome did not fall because the barbarians were invincible. Roma fell because she stopped being Roma. In the 2nd century, under the rule of emperors as Marco Aurelio, the empire still retained its discipline, its structure, and its identity, however. On the northern borders, beyond the damage and the kidney, something was beginning to move, peoples that Rome called barbarians. A word that simply meant, those who do not speak our language observed. Goths, Swabian Vandals, Franks, Alans, They were not one nation, they were not one army, were scattered tribes with distinct cultures, changing leadership and constant internal conflicts. But they had something in common under pressure, excessive pressure, climate pressure, military pressure, and when the ones burst from the steppes of Central Asia. Like a storm of darkness and fire, the balance of Europe collapsed. The Germanic peoples began to move. And when millions die, no empire can ignore it. Roma tried to do what she did best: absorber. Many barbarians did not arrive as conquistadors, but as refugees. In the year 376, tens of thousands of Goths requested to eradicate and settle within the empire. Roma accepted was the beginning of the end. Administrative corruption, the abuse of Roman officials, hunger and humiliation turned potential allies into desperate enemies. And in the year 378, something happened that should never have happened. The Battle of Adrianople. The Roman army was crushed. The brave emperor died on the... For the first time in centuries, Rome did not seem invincible. And when the illusion of invincibility is broken, fear spreads faster than any army. But the fall was not immediate. For decades, Roma tried to adapt, divided the empire into east and west, reorganized the army, recruited barbarians within its own ranks. Here begins the paradox. The same peoples that Rome feared began to become its advocates. Germanic generals commanded Roman legions. Federated soldiers defended the borders. Roman identity was being... And when a civilization loses clarity about who is, loses the will to survive. In the year 410, something unthinkable happened. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, entered Rome. The Eternal City was sacked. For 3 days, the heart of the empire burned. The world was in shock. Roma had been last sacked in the 390s, before Christ. Now 800 years later, it was burning again. It was not total destruction, but it was the ultimate psychological blow. If Roma could be raped, she could die. If you are discovering now, as the most powerful empire in history began to collapse from the inside, imagine what's coming. Because what Rome destroyed, it wasn't just the barbaric force, it was the fear, corruption, loss of discipline, If you are interested in this kind of deep story, subscribe now to Stoic Foundation. We don't tell myths here. We analyze lessons that history has left written in blood, and what is to come is even more brutal. After the looting of 410, Western Rome was injured but did not die. Still had armies, still had gold, still had influence, but I had lost something invisible: respect. Barbarian peoples no longer saw an invincible giant, saw a wobbly old man, and when predators perceive weakness, they attack. The Vandals crossed Hispania, then North Africa, took Carthago, and with Carthago, Rome lost control of grain. Without grain, there is no stability. Without stability, there is no empire. Barbarian generals as a rhizome ruled behind the shadows, placing and removing emperors as chess pieces. The imperial throne was turned into an empty chair. And in the year 476, the final act occurred. A Germanic chief named Odoacro deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus August. There was no great battle. There was no massive fire. Just a signature. A child emperor sent into exile, and thus lived in Rome. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. But here is the real question. It was the barbarians who brought down Rome. Oh, Roma was already down when they opened their doors, because the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, survived 1,000 more years. Then the problem was not only external, was an intern, and that changes the whole story. The fall of Rome was not an explosion, was a decadence, uncontrolled population, economic crisis, loss of civic values, excessive dependence on mercenaries. When a nation stops producing committed citizens, needs to hire defenders. And the hired defenders do not die as ideals. Struggle by salary. Rome became a hollow structure. And when the winds of migration hard, the structure collapsed. But the fall of Rome was not the end of civilization, was the beginning of a new Europe. The barbarian kingdoms did not destroy everything, adopted Roman laws. Roma thought she was eternal, and that belief was his first mistake. From the Stoic perspective, the first discipline is to understand the nature of reality. Everything is transitory: empires, power, wealth, fame. Marco Aurelio wrote, "Everything is ephemeral, both the memory and that which is remembered." Rome confused power with permanence, confused with stability, confused expansion with inner strength. Stoic philosophy teaches that nothing external can guarantee safety. When a nation deposits its identity in the military force or territorial expansion, is building on sand. The Stoic lesson here is clear. Attachment to external greatness generates internal fragility. Roma did not fall when it was attacked, began to fall when he stopped questioning himself, and the Stoic is always questioned, the storm of the ones and the ultimate collapse. Rome did not fall in a single day, fell when he lost his monopoly on fear. For centuries, the villages north of the Danube feared the advance of the legions. The mere rumor of a Roman standard was enough to entire tribes. But in the 4th century, something changed in the balance of the world. From the depths of the Eurasian steppes, a force emerged that respected no borders, neither pacts nor traditions. Were not like the Germans. They were not settled farmers, did not seek integration, were nomadic warriors on horseback, archers impossible to reach. When the Huns broke into Eastern Europe, did not attack Rome directly, struck first. To the Germanic peoples, the Alans were razed to the ground, the Ostrogoths were crushed, the Visigoths fled. And when an entire town flees for its survival, becomes a wave, unstoppable human being. Rome did not face an army, faced a massive migration forced by terror. In the year 376, tens of thousands of Visigoths crowded onto the banks of the Danube. Asked for asylum, they begged for how much Roma accepted. Not out of compassion for calculation. More men meant more soldiers. More workers plus taxes. But Roma made a fatal mistake. Underestimated despair. The officers, Romans in charge of managing the entry of the Visigoths sold food at abusive prices. Demanded bribes. Families separated. Humiliated those asking for protection. Tension exploded. And in the year 378, in the Battle of Adrian, the Roman army was annihilated. The brave emperor was burned to death in a tomb. Caught in the flames. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor fell before a force considered to be. The news spread like wildfire. Rome was bleeding, and their enemies knew it. The Huns continued to advance west with their leader. Attila would become the symbol of European terror. Attila, he did not seek to conquer Rome as Alejandro sought Persia, sought to subject her to extortion and humiliate her. For years, the empire, Eastern Roman, paid huge holes to prevent devastation. Gold in exchange for survival. Roma, who had dominated the world, now paid not to be destroyed. That psychological investment was devastating, because when a power pays tribute, ceases to be a powerhouse. In the year 451, Attila turned his gaze to the west, crossed the Rhine-raised cities in Gallia. His army advanced like an unstoppable shadow. But here comes one of the most important moments, extraordinary features of this story. Weakened and fragmented Roma, select one last unlikely alliance. The Roman general Flavius Aetius gathered Roman troops. Visigothic and Frankish. Romans and barbarians fighting together in the Catalan fields. Attila was arrested was not an absolute defeat, but it was a break. For a moment, it seemed that Roma still had strength. For a moment, it seemed that the empire could bleed. But that moment was brief. Aetius, the last great Roman general in the West, was succeeded by its own emperor, Valentinian III. Jealousy, intrigues, distrust. Rome did not need external enemies, self-destructed from the inside. When you eliminate your best leaders out of fear, collapse is a matter of time. 1 year later, Valentinian III was also seventh. Power became a farce. Barbarian generals controlled the army. Senators embodied emperors lasted months. Stability was an illusion. In the year 455, the Vandals sacked Rome. Yes, again. For 2 weeks, it was not a massacre. It was a methodical looting of the... They took gold, relics, symbols. The humiliation was profound. Rome was no longer the center of the world. It was a booty. If you are in Malaga now that Rome did not fall by a single sadness, but for decades of mistakes, internal and constant pressure, then you are already seeing the real lesson. Empires are not killed by external attacks. They die when they lose their discipline. If you want to continue to discover how this fall changed the course of civilization, Occidental, subscribe now to Stoic Foundation. Like this video and share it. Because history is not garbage. It is a warning, and what is coming is the end. After the death of Attila, in the 453, Empire I collapsed rapidly. Without their leader, the savage tribes rebelled. But the damage was already done. Migrations had overflowed the Roman borders. The Visigoths established their kingdom in Hispania. Vandals dominated North Africa. The Franks were consolidating in Gallia. Rome no longer governed provinces. tolerated kingdoms, and that difference changed everything. In the year 476, Germanic chief Odoacer, in the service of Rome, demanded land for his soldiers. The emperor, Romulus Augustulus, refused. Odoacer advanced. There was no epic battle. There was no resistance. The young emperor was deposed and sent into exile. Odoacer did not proclaim himself emperor, sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, recognized the authority of the Eastern Emperor. West simply ceased to exist as an independent entity, and so it cost officially the Western Roman Empire. Without a final cataclysm, without an explosion, only with exhaustion. But here comes the deepest question. Barbarians really destroyed Rome? Or simply occupied a space that Rome could no longer support? Because when we analyze the internal factors, we found uncontrolled snow, excessive devalued currency, unbearable tax burdens, foreign military dependence, leadership crisis. The barbarians did not fix these problems, only took advantage of the weakness. Rome fell because it ceased to be a republic of citizens, committed, and became a curtain of power. From its moral base, when civic virtue disappears, the political edifice becomes dynamic. And that's not just ancient history, is a warning to the Eastern Roman Empire, with capital in Constantinople, survived 1,000 more years. Why? Because we ask for more efficient administration, because it retained strategic resources, because he knew how to adapt better. The fall of the West was not inevitable due to external causes, was the result of accumulated decisions. And that's what makes this story so powerful. Because he does not speak only of the past, speaks of any society that knows its foundations. Rome was more than an empire, was a system of laws, a model of organization, an idea of order in the face of chaos. The barbarians did not destroy this idea, inherited it and transformed it, and on its ruins was born medieval Europe. Latin became Romance languages. Roman laws influenced later codes. Christianity, adopted by the empire, expanded further. Rome died politically, but culturally survived. And that is the final paradox. The barbarians, they did not erase Roma from the map, they reconfigured it. Sometimes the end of one era is the beginning of another. Sometimes the fall is a transformation. But the Stoic lesson remains: nothing is eternal, neither power nor glory nor fear. Only virtue can sustain what is built. And when virtue is lost, the empire is already doomed. The sum did not destroy Rome for its brute force, but because of the psychological effect generated by Epictete, taught us that it is not the facts that harm us, but our interpretation of them. When Roma started paying tribute to Attila, lost more than just gold, lost moral authority. The Stoic distinguishes between what is under our control, disciplines, decisions. Character, what is not under our control, invasions. Climate migrations, internultion, and the death of the Roman ideal. Rome did not die when Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus. Roma died when she stopped believing in herself. Because no empire can be sustained only by walls, legions, and gold. An empire holds its own with conviction, with identity, for shared purpose. And in the 5th century, that identity was fragmented. During the Republic, Rome was built on a central virtue: civic responsibility. The Roman citizen served in the army, participated in politics, defended the city. Glory was not only individual, collective era, but the empire transformed that dynamic The citizen became a subject. Military service ceased to be a duty and became a princess. Politics ceased to be a debate and became survival. Expansion had been its strength. Expansion was now its burden. Too vast a territory required too many resources, excessive. Strict surveillance, and when the cost of maintaining the empire exceeded the benefits of belonging to it, cohesion began to break. The Roman economy suffered a slow asphyxia. To hold increasingly numerous armies in the state, increased taxes, when revenues did not reach, reduced silver content in coins. Curiosity grew. Prices soared. Trade became unstable. The little farmer, traditional basis of Roman power, began to disappear. The lands were concentrated in large estates. Impoverished peasants migrated to the cities, or submitted as to powerful landowners. The social fabric was weakening. An empire can resist external invasions, but it cannot withstand the constant erosion of its base. Economic, the army was changing. The disciplined and cohesive British legions were replaced progressively by auxiliary and federated troops, many of them barbarians who served under their own leaders. This was not necessarily a weakness in itself. For centuries, Rome successfully integrated foreigners. The difference was now different. Loyalty was no longer directed to Rome, was addressed to the general who paid the salary. And when soldiers are loyal to individuals and not to institutions, the state becomes dynamic. A coup d'etat multiplied. Emperors proclaimed by the army, worn by the same army months later. Between the year 235 and the year 200, the empire had more than 20 emperors, most of them Mexican. That instability left deep scars. The authority became provisional. Political continuity disappeared. Rome no longer seemed eternal, looked improvised. Christianity also transformed the empire. When Constantino legalized the new religion and Theodosius made it an officer, the spiritual landscape changed radically. For some historians, this transition weakened the Roman martial spirit. For others, was simply an inevitable cultural adaptation. The truth is that the mentality has changed. Military glory was no longer the only horizon. Eternal life replaced with earthly fame. The structure. Roman culture was redefined while facing external characteristics, and in times of crisis, profound changes can further destabilize. But the most dangerous one was psychological. Rome faced decadence. Each looting was explained as temporary. Every defeat as an accident. Every crisis as a passing one, until the passenger became permanent. The gradual loss of control over provinces. Westerners did not generate a decisive reaction. The barbarian kingdoms were accepted as a territorial adjustment, began to coexist with the Roman administration. The imperial authority no longer imposed negotiations. When a superpower begins to negotiate its own survival, the end is near, the Eastern Roman Empire observed. From Constantinople, the emperors kept their distance from the Western crisis. With more resources, a stronger economy and more defensible borders, Byzantium survived, but the West did not have that advantage, geographic or financial. The capital was moved from Rome to Ravenna, city most protected by Rome swamps. The city that gave its name, empire ceased to be a real political center. That symbolic gesture was devastating. The capital had moved. The heart was no longer beating in the same place. In the middle of the 5th century, the Western imperial throne was a fiction sustained by Germanic generals. Rhizome of Swabian and Visigothic origin ruled, behind the shadows for years, placed emperors and removed them as appropriate. Rome was ruled by men who decades earlier would have been considered foreigners. Was not necessarily a betrayal, it was pragmatism. But constant pragmatism without a firm identity leads to dissolution. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, symbolizes historical irony, his name combined. Romulo, mythical founder of Rome, and Augusto, the first emperor, was a child, an empty symbol when Odoacro deposed him in 476. There was no significant resistance. The Roman Senate accepted the change. Imperial insignia were sent to Constantinople. There was no popular revolution. There was no patriotic uprising, only acceptance. Rome did not fall, fighting fell resignedly. And that resignation was his deepest defeat. But here's the most powerful lesson for us. The barbarians did not destroy Rome from the outside. Rome weakened from the inside until the external blow. It was only the final push. Empires do not die from isolated invasions. Fight for the accumulation of wrong decisions, for the loss of issue, by the erosion of fundamental values. And when identity dissolves, the territory is irrelevant. The fall of Western Rome ushered in a new era. The average age, the Germanic kingdoms adopted Roman structures. Roman law survived. Latin evolved. The church became heir. Institutional framework of the imperial order. Civilization is not extinct, was transformed, but the world that Roma knew disappeared. International trade declined. Cities declined, literacy declined. Western Europe entered centuries of reconfiguration, all because the greatest empire of its time ceased to lay its own foundations. The final question of this scene is not historical. Is philosophy that really sustains a civilization. The army wealth, territorial expansion, or moral discipline and collective responsibility. Marco Aurelio wrote that decadence begins when the individual ceases to act in accordance with virtue. Roma ignored this warning and paid the price. Seneca warned that decadence begins in the soul, before the walls the virgin. Corruption, the struggle for power, were symptoms. The cause was the erosion of civic virtue. In the Republic, the citizen was responsible. In the late Empire, the citizen was a spectator. The Stoicism argues that the community depends on individual self-control. When individuals stop practicing justice, temperance and discipline, the collective structure breaks down. Rome lost austerity's sense of duty, Republican leadership, and replaced it with comfort and personal ambition. Stoic lesson. A system is so strong as the character of those who sustain it. Rome was not destroyed by barbarians, it was weakened by Romans who stopped living. In accordance with its principles, the eternal legacy and the true Stoic lesson, Rome fell, but the world did not lose the legions. Stopped marching under the imperial in the west, but the Roman roads were still there. The cities, although reduced, still retained walls. The laws, although adapted, were still applied. Latin, although fragmented, remained a language of power and faith. That's what makes the fall of Rome unique. It was not a total annihilation, it was a metamorphosis when Odoacro sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, implicitly recognized that the Roman authority had not completely disappeared. The Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Empire, continued for almost 1,000 more years. Constantinople was transformed. Rome, more Greek in culture, more strategic in location, more efficient in management. While the West fragmented into Germanic kingdoms, the East preserved the imperial tradition. This demonstrates something fundamental. The fall of Rome was not inevitable due to external forces. Uncontrollable was a difference in management, discipline and adaptation. The Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Franks in Gallia did not completely destroy the Roman structure. Many of their kings admired the imperial model, adopted Roman titles, used Roman law, maintained inherited tax systems. Even Christianity became the official religion. Under Theodosius, acted as a cultural bridge between Romans and barbarians. The church preserved classical texts, includes literacy, retained administrative structure. Roma survived in invisible forms, but the impact was real. Trade routes in the Western Mediterranean, urban production fell. Economic complexity decreased. Europe entered a period of decentralization. It was not a dark age, absolute as believed for centuries. But it was an era of profound transition. Power was no longer concentrated in a single center, redistributed. And with this, the medieval political map was born. Here arises the central Stoic-based reflection. Rome was not defeated only by the strength of their enemies, was defeated by the loss of its foundation, the discipline that built the Republic, the austerity that sustained its first centuries, the civic responsibility that drove its expansion. Over time, abundance replaced austerity. Comfort replaced resilience. Politics replaced virtue. When a civilization becomes complacent, its structure is weakened. And when external crises arrive, does not find the strength to survive. Stoicism was born in a world of philosophers such as Seneca, Epictetus, and Marco Aurelius taught that true power is not external but internal. An empire can control territories, but if he does not control his character, he is doomed. Marco Aurelio ruled in times of plagues and wars. Yet he wrote about self-control, duty, and virtue. His warning was ignored for generations. Rome sought stability in the expansion. But real stability was always moral. The fall of Rome is a universal lesson. Every organization, every nation, every institution, even every individual can achieve greatness. But greatness does not stand alone. Requires adaptation, requires sound principles. When these principles erode, the fall is not immediately perceived as gradual, silent disguised as normal. Roma didn't wake up one day and discovered that he was collapsing, slowly collapsed for centuries until one day simply ceased to exist. However, his legacy is unquestionable. Roman law influenced modern legal systems. Romance languages are derived from Latin. Architecture, urban planning, Roman engineering are still a reference. Even the idea of empire in the West is measured by comparing it to Rome. That is historical transcendence. A political power can disappear. A civilization can be transformed, but a powerful idea can take millennia. Rome was defeated militarily, but culturally never disappeared. Today, when we observe any modern superpower, comparison with Rome is inevitable. Parallels exist. Excessive military expansion, political polarization, periodic economic crisis, dependence on structures, complex, difficult to sustain. History does not exactly repeat itself, but rhymes. And that is the reason why studying the fall of Rome is not strictly academic, is prevention. The last lesson is deeply Stoic. Nothing external is permanent, nor is the power, nor wealth, nor territorial domination. The only truly lasting thing is the character. Rome lost its character before losing its walls, and when the character is lost, the structure falls by itself. The fall of the largest empire in history was not caused solely by barbarians with swords. It was caused by accumulated decisions, for corruption tolerated, for relaxed discipline, for sacrificed principles. The barbarians, they only painted a door that was already open, and this is how this story ends. Not as an absolute tragedy, but as an eternal warning. Empires can collapse. Civilizations can be transformed. But the lessons remain. Rome fell. But its echo still resonates. And as long as history is studied, Rome will never die at all. Legacy and transformation. The Stoic does not fear the fall, understands it as part of the natural order. Everything composed decomposes everything born inside. Every empire eventually transforms. Marco Aurelio wrote that the universe is change. Rome fell as a political structure, but its cultural essence survived, and that reflects a profound Stoic principle. Nothing disappears completely, only changes shape. The real defeat is not losing power, is to lose virtue. Rome lost political control, but his philosophy, his law, and his legacy transcended. And that shows something extraordinary. Ideas are stronger than armies. The fall of Rome is a Stoic lesson in 4 acts. An illusion of eternity. 2 reactions from fear. 3, corruption of character. 4, inevitable transformation. The final teaching is powerful. We cannot control history. We cannot control invasions. We cannot control time. But we can control our character. Rome fell when it lost its foundation, and that is the most Stoic warning of all.